Hello and welcome to the Deathcast. I'm your host, author, and journalist Ian Totten. I'd like to thank you for joining me as we prepare to take our fourth look at Jeffrey Dahmer. Before we get going, as always, I have the normal show notes. If you'd like to follow me on social media, just search for the Deathcast. If you'd like to help the show out, there's a couple of things you can do. First and foremost, you can go to your favorite podcast app, follow the show, and leave a 5-star review. You can also go to tinyurl.com/dcast Patreon, where for as little as $1.99 a month, you can get access to early and ad-free shows, just like my first two Patreon members, Channel and Anthony, did. As have my largest Patreon contributors monthly, Debbie, Samantha, Betty, and Matt. All of them went to tinyurl.com/dcast Patreon, and I appreciate them greatly. Now, a quick aside before we get into the business at hand. R.I.P. Hulk Hogan. I don't care what you think of the guy as a human being, because there's no such thing as a perfect person, but he was a huge part of my childhood as well as many others. Alright, now that all of that is out of the way, find yourself a nice comfy chair. Kick back and relax. If you are at work, I hope this helps you get through the day. I've got my coffee. I've got my cigarettes. Let's go into the crypt. We left off last time. Jeffrey had moved into his own apartment in the Oxford apartment buildings in Milwaukee and was living in apartment 213. And he had begun to take the lives of men that he met at gay bars, dismembering them in his bathtub and keeping parts of them. We also talked about Dahmer's first forays into cannibalism, which is really the thing that he is most known for. A lot of people forget the actual facts of this case and instead zero in on the fact that, he was storing body parts in his apartment and eating his victims. Now, after this first experiment with cannibalism, Dahmer goes about his routine. He later stated that there were a few encounters with individuals where he did not take their lives, although he could not describe why this was. This actually isn't that unusual, however, as serial killers, when they're in their cooling off period, are less likely to reoffend, even if the opportunity presents itself, unless there is something about a specific individual that sparks that thing inside of them which makes them crave taking that person's life. We do know that Dahmer, during this point in time, early 1990, is starting his spiral. His fantasies are becoming even more demanding, twisted, and disturbed. He goes out and purchases a pair of handcuffs to facilitate further control of future victims. He also starts to play with the idea mentally of making a sex slave. Someone who would basically be a zombie and whom Jeffrey could have complete control over, that would never leave him and who would not die. Dahmer also brought a black leather strap, as he thought that it might help with the act of strangulation. David Thomas, a 22-year-old, met Dahmer in the early morning hours of September 24th, 1990. According to Dahmer, after getting Thomas back to his apartment and drugging him, he realized that Thomas was not his type. So Dahmer decides to just kill the man and get rid of his remains entirely. No remains of Thomas are ever discovered. And it was one of the murders that there just isn't an entirely large amount of information about. We know that during this period of time, Dahmer started to get rather sloppy in his killing, leaving bodies dead in his apartment for days on end, either completely intact or in various stages of dismemberment. This led to individuals in the apartment making complaints about the smell. Eventually, the police are called as it's thought that someone may have died inside of their apartment. However, after checking all of the apartments, they are unable to discern the location of this foul odor. Eventually, the tenants who live across from Jeffrey Dahmer realize the smell is coming from his apartment, and they contact the building superintendent, who meets with Dahmer. Jeffrey tells the man that his freezer has broken, and the smell is that of meat which has spoiled. After a cursory examination of the freezer, the man accepts Dahmer's explanation. This man later stated that Dahmer seemed embarrassed by the confrontation and the fact that the smell from his apartment was leading to so much trouble. However, this does not stop Dahmer in his murderous quest, nor does it do anything to dispel the stench that, on occasion, permeates the Oxford apartments. On February 17th of 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer was riding the bus over near Marquette University when he spotted 17-year-old Curtis Straughter standing near a bus stop. Dahmer would later state that he spoke with Curtis, offering him money if he'll return to the apartment and pose nude for him. This is pretty much, at this point, Jeffrey Dahmer's modus operandi. We know that once back in the apartment, Dahmer took some photographs before drugging Straughter and handcuffing him. Dahmer then strangles the young man and eventually begins the process of dismembering his body, keeping various parts, including the skull, hands, and genitals. With the exception of David Thomas, Dahmer takes photographs of the entire process from the point when the victim is inside of his apartment through the drugging and what Dahmer does to them after this, as well as the victims in various stages of the dismemberment process. Dahmer would often pose them, and he would use these photographs for later gratification while he was masturbating. Dahmer would also state in later interviews that usually after taking a victim's life, he would lie with them, pulling the victim's arms around him to simulate a consensual embrace. Some have postulated that this stems from abandonment issues that he had felt growing up. However, we will never know with absolute certainty what led Jeffrey Dahmer to need this type of embrace, beyond the fact that, by his own admission, he always felt alone, unloved, and rejected. It's during this point in time, early 1991, that Jeffrey starts looking to create this sex slave that he had dreamed of. We know that he began drilling holes in his victims' heads with a Black & Decker drill that he had purchased and injecting hydrochloric acid in their brains in an attempt to lobotomize them and basically turn them into a living mannequin that he could live out his fantasies with. However, when Dahmer would do this, the victim would invariably begin reacting in a manner he was not expecting, twitching and convulsing, or outright dying. On April 17th, Jeffrey Dahmer encountered a 19-year-old man by the name of Errol Lindsay, who was on his way to get a key cut. Dahmer was able to get the man to come to his apartment, at which point he drugs him and drills a hole in his head. However, Lindsay does not die, and he ends up coming to, complaining of a headache. Jeffrey then drugs him again and manually strangles him. Dahmer stated that he wanted to keep Lindsay's skin, so he flays the man and places his skin in a solution of cold water and salt for a period of weeks. However, as time goes by, Dahmer noticed that Lindsay's skin is becoming brittle and frayed, and as with the rest of the body save for the skull, Jeffrey ends up disposing of it. We can see at this point that the cooling off period between Dahmer's murders is becoming shorter and shorter as his mania, his spiraling, begins to pick up steam. On May 24th, 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer encounters a 31-year-old deaf and mute man by the name of Tony Hughes at a nightclub. Dahmer and Hughes speak via writing notes to one another, and eventually Jeffrey is able to get Hughes back to his apartment, where they continue writing notes to one another. Dahmer eventually drugs Hughes and drills a hole into his skull, injecting hydrochloric acid once again. However, on this occasion, the injection of the acid proves fatal. Dahmer ends up leaving Hughes' body lying on the floor of his bedroom for at least 3 days before bringing it into the bathroom, at which point Dahmer begins the typical dissection process. However, before that process could actually begin, Dahmer has a chance encounter with a 14-year-old by the name of Conorak Synthasamphone, who was the brother of the young boy that Jeffrey Dahmer had sexually assaulted in 1988. According to Dahmer, he encountered the young man while he was out window shopping at around 5 p.m., and upon seeing him, he offered the boy money to come back to his apartment and pose for some pictures. They go back to the apartment. Dahmer takes 2 pictures of Conorak before giving him a drink laced with sleeping pills, and according to Jeffrey, he leads the young boy back into the bedroom where the body of his last victim, Tony Hughes, is lying, becoming bloated from decomposition. Dahmer stated he believed that Conorak had seen the body, but due to the drugs that were in his system, it didn't register in his mind. What happens next is one of the more infamous episodes to come out of the Jeffrey Dahmer saga. We know that he sexually assaulted Conorak, that he drilled a hole into the crown of his head, injecting hydrochloric acid into the frontal lobe before starting to drink. We also know that Dahmer left the apartment at some point during the evening to go out and drink some more at a bar. However, when Dahmer returns to the apartment, he finds the young boy sitting outside on the sidewalk speaking in Laotian to 3 women who are obviously distressed. Dahmer approaches these 3 women, telling them that Conorak is a friend of his, and attempts to lead the young boy away. However, the women will not allow this and instead dial 911. When the police arrive, they notice nothing physically wrong with the young boy beyond a scraped knee. Dahmer then goes on to tell them that the young boy is in fact his 19-year-old lover, that they'd had a quarrel, and that Conorak had gotten intoxicated on Jack Daniels following this. Dahmer attempts to persuade the officers to allow him to lead the young boy back to his apartment, at which point the three women begin to interject themselves, informing the officers that Conorak had attempted to push Dahmer away when he had earlier tried to bring him up to the apartment, had blood on his testicles and coming from his rectum. All three of these women would later tell authorities under oath that these officers told them, quote, to butt out and get the fuck away from them now. Eventually, members of the fire department are going to arrive and look at Conorak. They want to treat the boy, but the police officers will not allow them to, and ask the personnel from the fire department to leave. They do, and another officer arrives, and all of them goes up to Dahmer's apartment, where Dahmer is said to have been very chatty, telling the officers about the high crime rate in the neighborhood and expressing his appreciation for the service that the officers perform. Now, inside the apartment, Dahmer said he showed the officers the two Polaroid pictures he had taken the previous night of Conorak as proof that the two men were lovers. One of the officers later stated under oath that when they were in the apartment he smelled nothing unusual, while his partner said that there was a whiff of human excrement in the air, which he went to investigate, sticking his head into the bedroom only briefly. Dahmer later said that the officer was only back there for a few seconds. Obviously, the officers saw this as a domestic dispute between gay lovers and did not want to get too involved in the situation. Had they really wanted to check into things, they would very easily have found the body of Anthony Hughes in Dahmer's bedroom. However, they did not, and telling Dahmer that he needed to take care of Conorak, the officers leave the apartment, thus sealing Conorak's fate. Once the officers had left, Jeffrey Dahmer injects a fatal dose of acid into Conorak's brain and spends the night with his body. The following day, Dahmer calls off of work and spends his waking hours dismembering the two bodies that are in his apartment, keeping various parts of their bodies as well as their skulls. From this point forward, Jeffrey Dahmer really goes into a killing frenzy, taking victims in rather rapid succession from the last as his mania spirals faster and faster, which is eventually going to lead to his discovery and imprisonment. As for Conorak, his family reports him missing. Flyers end up going up all around the area and in some of the local newspapers, all to no avail. It's true that one of the women who encountered Conorak outside of Dahmer's apartment building saw Conorak's picture in the local newspaper and contacted the FBI, explaining the situation to them. However, the FBI informed her that she needed to contact the Milwaukee Police Department, which she did do. However, it appears that the police department either simply dropped the ball on the information, or more likely than not, did not take this woman's story seriously. According to Dahmer, he saw the boy's picture inside the newspaper and did not realize at that point that this young boy was the younger brother of the individual whose sexual assault had sent him to jail. Speaking about it at a later date, Dahmer said, quote, "If I'd known who I was dealing with, I sure as hell wouldn't have bothered asking him back. That's for sure." We know that immediately following this, Jeffrey Dahmer's grandmother was involved in a car accident, and that he was forced to leave his murderous rampage briefly to tend to her. He later expressed hope that his grandmother would no longer drive and would instead spend time with her cat. Also during this period of time, Dahmer is known to have told the various counselors and support groups that he was court-mandated to attend that he was seriously considering committing suicide and that he did not understand why he was a homosexual. During one of these sessions, Dahmer informed his counselor that he was quickly running out of money and would soon have to leave his apartment. And this shows pretty well the spiral that Jeffrey Dahmer has now found himself in, where he's had this job for a number of years, and while it doesn't pay him a great deal, he is able to live a normal lifestyle. However, as his alcoholism and his murder spree picks up steam, he is losing control more and more over his life. On June 30th, Jeffrey Dahmer travels by bus to Chicago, where he encounters a 20-year-old by the name of Matt Turner at the bus station. He's able to convince Turner to return to his apartment with him, where Jeffrey murders Turner, putting his head and internal organs in separate bags, which he then places into the freezer. Less than a week later, Dahmer meets another man in Chicago, this one 23-year-old Jeremiah Weinberg. Dahmer ends up drilling a hole in Weinberg's head and injecting boiling water into his brain at least twice. This sends Weinberg into a coma from which he will never recover. As with the others, Dahmer will end up dismembering Weinberg inside of the apartment. 10 days later, Jeffrey Dahmer meets a 24-year-old by the name of Oliver Lacey. This is in Milwaukee on July 15th. Dahmer stated that he intended to spend more time with Lacey than he had with previous victims, so Dahmer ends up calling out of work the next day, which ends up leading to his suspension from the Ambrosia Chocolate Factory. Dahmer goes through his normal routine with the body of Lacey, putting Lacey's head and heart inside of the refrigerator and his skeleton in the freezer. Now, I want you to think about this. Jeffrey Dahmer's committing all of these murders in rapid succession as his mania continues to spiral. He now has multiple victims inside of his apartment who are in various stages of decomposition and dismemberment. He's bathing with torsos inside of the bathtub. On July 19th, Jeffrey Dahmer is informed that he's in fact being terminated from his job at the Ambrosia Chocolate Factory due to excessive absenteeism. Dahmer leaves his apartment and encounters a 25-year-old by the name of Joseph Bradahoft at a bus station near Marquette University. He ends up lying in Dahmer's bed for 2 days after Dahmer murders him, meaning Dahmer sleeps with the man's body in the bed. Dahmer stated that he placed a sheet over the body, and after 2 days he removed the sheet to discover that the head was completely covered with maggots, at which point Dahmer began the dismemberment process, cleaning off the head and placing it inside of the refrigerator. Somewhere along the way, Jeffrey Dahmer ends up getting a large plastic 55-gallon drum into which he places the torsos of some of the victims in sulfuric acid. And we can see during this period the full extent of Jeffrey Dahmer's spiral. He is no longer the careful, calculating killer who is taking steps to avoid detection. He is at a complete loss to control himself, his desires, and is simply allowing those desires to run rampant across every aspect of his life. Dahmer later said that by this point, he had given up the task of dissecting his victims as meticulously as he had in the past, as he was simply too tired. However, he did remove the flesh from the body of Oliver Lacey. Dahmer's plan was to use Lacey's skeleton along with that of Ernest Miller to adorn his shrine. He also said that he had begun to consider the idea of embalming one of his victims so that he could keep them with him forever, perfectly preserved. However, this was tempered by the fact that the body would eventually begin to decay, and also by the fact that Dahmer, who it's been stated looked into this, would require $30,000 to have the machine that would make this possible. Speaking about this point in time, Jeffrey Dahmer later said, "If I'd been thinking rationally, I would have stopped. I wasn't thinking rationally because it just increased and increased. It was almost like I wanted it to get to a point where it was out of my control and there was no return. I mean, I was very careful for years and years, you know. Very careful about making sure nothing incriminating remained, but these last few months, they just went nuts." Dahmer went on to further elaborate, stating that he believed that his trip to Chicago is when things really picked up steam and his entire existence began to spiral out of control. Quote, "It just seems like it went into a frenzy this last month. Everything really came crashing down. The whole thing started falling down around my head. That was the last week I was going to be in that apartment building. I was going to have to move out and find somewhere to put all my possessions. Should I get a chest and put what I wanted to keep in that, or get rid of the rest? Or should I put an end to this, try to stop this, and find a better direction for my life? That's what was going through my mind that last week." During this last week, Dahmer ends up encountering one of his former co-workers who gives him a ride. This individual later stated that Dahmer told him he wanted to get out of Wisconsin and was thinking of returning to Florida. On July 21st, Jeffrey Dahmer encounters two individuals at the mall. Dahmer tries to entice them back to his apartment, however, both men decline. The next day of July 22nd, Dahmer ends up encountering the superintendent of the building, who lets him know that he may not be in the apartment until his lease expires, as the stench that is coming from his apartment has gotten to the point that he can no longer allow Jeffrey to stay there. After leaving the apartment building, Dahmer encounters numerous individuals asking them if they want to come back to his apartment to pose for pictures, all of whom decline. By 3:30 that afternoon, he is at the mall once again, talking to men, trying to get them to come back to the apartment. Later in that afternoon, after having approached numerous individuals, Jeffrey Dahmer is outside of the mall when he spies three people standing together. He approaches these men and asks them if they want to come back to his apartment to pose for pictures or watch videos with him. One of these men is an individual by the name of Tracy Edwards. Now, during testimony, it's later stated that Dahmer was asked if sex was involved. He replied that this was not the case and that instead he just wants to handcuff somebody. The four of them then leave, walking to a liquor store. He's in there. Tracy Edwards' brother, who is across the street in a bar with his girlfriend, comes out and talks to this trio. Learning what they are up to, he advises all three men that this does not sound like a good idea. Tracy Edwards' friends end up wandering off, although Tracy ends up staying, waiting for Dahmer. The two men get a cab outside of a Greyhound station, leaving Edwards' two friends behind. Tracy's older brother eventually reconnects with Tracy's friends and learns that his brother has gone with this strange individual, and that this man has told them that he lives at the Ambassador Hotel. So, Tracy's brother and one of his friends walk to the Ambassador Hotel in an effort to try and stop Tracy from whatever it is that he is planning to do with this man. Obviously, they do not find Tracy or this man at the hotel. Tracy arrives at Dahmer's apartment. He would later state that the apartment stunk of a foul odor that seemed to cling to everything. Although it was neat, he said that Dahmer seemed to not really be there mentally. Upon noticing 4 boxes of muriatic acid sitting on the floor, Edwards asks this strange individual what their purpose is, to which Dahmer responds that he uses the acid to clean bricks. According to Tracy Edwards, he realized that he was in an extremely precarious situation and that whatever was going on with this man was not what was promised, and that he needs to keep his wits about him so that he can get out of this situation without any harm befalling him. Edwards does this by talking to Dahmer about the various gay scenes in the area, particularly Milwaukee and Chicago. Now, Dahmer says that everything from this point forward is fuzzy in his mind. Tracy Edwards states that at some point, Dahmer pointed out the fish tank to him, and while his attention was diverted, Dahmer places a handcuff on Edwards' wrist. When he asks Dahmer what's going on, Jeffrey responds that it's only a joke, he's not going to hurt him. The keys to the handcuff are in the bedroom. The two men walk back into the bedroom, and Edwards notices that The Exorcist Part 2 is playing on the television as though this was something that Dahmer had set up already, that there are photographs of naked men on the walls, and also that there is a large blue drum sitting in one corner. When Edwards asks Dahmer what's going on, Dahmer informs him he's not going to hurt him so long as he allows him to handcuff Edwards and take some nude photographs of him. Edwards later stated that he realizes at this point that he's in serious danger, so he makes every effort to keep his hands away from one another so that Dahmer cannot get the handcuff on his other wrist as he continues talking to Dahmer, trying to discern why the man wants him handcuffed. Edwards stated that Dahmer informed him that he wanted to do this so that he could be in control, and at this point he pulls out the knife that he has used to dismember his victims. Edwards tells Dahmer that he will allow him to proceed so long as Dahmer puts away the knife. To show his sincerity, Edwards removes his shirt, telling Dahmer that he wants to go into the bathroom to take off the rest of his clothing. Edwards stated that upon seeing his exposed chest, Dahmer told him that he was very beautiful, and that Dahmer sat on the edge of the bed, rocking back and forth, almost as though he were in a trance, alternating between placing his head against Tracy's chest to listen to his insides and watching The Exorcist 2. There's some more altercations between the two men. Edwards is able to push the knife beneath the bed and get them back out into the living room. Once there, Dahmer goes to the refrigerator to look for a beer. Edwards tells Dahmer that he can trust him. So long as he takes off the handcuffs, he will do whatever it is that Dahmer wants. Dahmer says he will go back into the bedroom to get the handcuff key, and at this point, Tracy Edwards makes for the door. However, Dahmer rushes after him, telling him please not to leave. Tracy Edwards makes his escape from Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment. And it's out in the street that Tracy Edwards, one handcuff still on his wrist, is able to flag down two police officers and let them know what has occurred, at which point the officers return to the apartment with Tracy Edwards, and the rest, as they say, is history. I'm going to play a couple of news clips on Jeffrey Dahmer's arrest. These aired on July 23rd, 1991, a little more than a week ago, 34 years ago.
A gruesome story leads off our newscast.
Milwaukee police found body parts in a North Side apartment, and now they wonder if they've uncovered some kind of death factory. This was the scene earlier this morning. Police hired a private contractor to haul a refrigerator and a tank of acid out of the apartment in the 900 block of North 25th Street. Because of the acid, some neighbors were evacuated briefly. Police found parts of bodies, leading them to believe the man they arrested is a mass murderer.
From our investigation, we feel that this individual strongly is involved in other homicides. We have taken evidence out of the building by the medical examiner to be examined.
What brought the police here in the first place?
The officers were stopped by an individual who claimed he was in the apartment and became engaged in a dispute with the owner of the apartment and left the apartment and called the officers.
A 31-year-old man was arrested at that apartment. The Milwaukee County Medical Examiner will release more details on this case this morning at 10 o'clock. But a police lieutenant tells us he suspects this case could get national attention and could be the most gruesome case we have seen in Milwaukee in years.
From our investigation, we feel that this individual strongly is involved in other homicides. We have taken evidence out of the building by the medical examiner to be examined.
Police removed boxes and boxes of body parts, evidence of what appears to be a psychopathic mass murder. Authorities also took out a barrel of what they think is acid. Police are reluctant to reveal exactly how many victims there might be, but knowledgeable investigators say it could be more than a half a dozen. Neighbors say the man was strange and that there was an odor coming from the apartment. However, no one suspected the accumulation of dead bodies.
And the next thing I know, I heard the police open the refrigerator door, and they said it was a dead body in there.
Police are questioning the suspect downtown. All we really know about him is that he is 31 years old.
I really don't know much about him. I know he's a single guy, and he works every day, and he's like stay to himself.
Authorities marched out of the house with boxes of severed body parts. In a barrel wheeled out, a vat of acid. In a refrigerator left as it was found, at least two heads, the severed remains of victims of the alleged murderer. This morning, in an unprecedented news conference, the police chief, medical examiner, and district attorney joined in a public statement.
At this point, all we can tell you is that it is a number of homicides, multiples. The investigation is still very dynamic. We don't know whether this individual acted by himself or in consort with other individuals.
The big question now is the identity of the victims, whose heads, hands, and genitals were saved in the apartment. Dentists and doctors have already started the grisly effort. So far, no identities have been determined. And the area's top prosecutor wants other victims who might have survived an encounter to come forward.
And we would certainly urge anyone that's had such an experience to step forward. For one reason or another, persons don't do that. Or perhaps there's an aspect of their experience that they don't wish to share with the public. However, in this case, I would certainly urge, if there are any individuals who had an experience in this vicinity, we would certainly urge them to contact the police immediately.
And actually handcuffed and threatened with a knife. Through some rather fortuitous circumstances, the individual was able to make his escape from the apartment.
When police returned to arrest the man, there was a struggle, and the uniformed police officers made the horrific discovery: dismembered human remains, decapitated heads in a refrigerator freezer, limbs and male genitals in other containers, and a large barrel full of acid. Experienced homicide detectives say the killings have a sexual component. The male victims allegedly killed by a 31-year-old man, Jeffery Dahmer, a man with a criminal history of sexual assault of a teenage boy. Yet no one expected the overnight discovery.
So there you have some of the very first news accounts of Jeffrey Dahmer's arrest. To say that this story exploded across the national landscape is an understatement. As more and more details became public, the story picked up steam. Much like with the O.J. Simpson trial, the arrest of Jeffrey Dahmer and subsequent events permeated the American consciousness to a degree that really has not duplicated itself since Dahmer's arrest. Yes, there have been many serial killers discovered in the period of time since Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested, but none of them have grabbed the attention of the public and of the news media to the degree that Jeffrey Dahmer did. This was fueled by the fact that Jeffrey Dahmer readily began confessing to his horrific crimes in the early morning hours of July 23rd. And Dahmer is going to end up being questioned by these officers for over 60 hours in the next 2 weeks. And Dahmer did waive his right during these interviews to have a lawyer present while he was interrogated. Jeffrey Dahmer said at one point, quote, "I have created this horror, and it only makes sense that I do everything to put an end to it." Dahmer went into great detail about these murders with one exception, that of his second victim, Stephen Tuyami, who Dahmer stated he could not recall having murdered, nor could he remember whether or not Stephen was conscious or unconscious at the time that Dahmer killed him in the Ambassador Hotel. More than that, though, Dahmer readily admitted to having performed acts of necrophilia with the victim's bodies once he was inside the Oxford apartments, including, but not limited to, having had sex with their viscera, and also to having eaten parts of some of his victims, specifically Raymond Smith, Ernest Miller, and Oliver Lacey, stating that the parts he had saved of other victims, save for the heads, he had intended to consume at a later date. When asked why he committed these acts of cannibalism, Dahmer said that at first it had been out of curiosity, but as his murder spree continued and grew larger, quote, "I suppose in an odd way it made me feel they were even more a permanent part of me." Dahmer said that he had been completely swept along by the murders during the last 2 months of his freedom, unable to control himself or do anything to stop the acts that he was committing. Quote, "It was an incessant and never-ending desire to be with someone at whatever cost. Someone good-looking, really nice-looking. It just filled my thoughts all day long." Dahmer also talked about the altar that he planned to construct using victims' bones. Dahmer planned to put skulls along the front of the black table that he had purchased, the one that had the Griffiths on it, with the skeletons of 2 of the victims, Miller and Lacey, on either end. There were to be sticks of incense burning besides these. He also wanted to place the altar in front of a window in the apartment, which would be covered by a black curtain. All of this was to be lit by a blue lamp from above, and he intended to sit in front of this altar in a black leather chair. When further pressed about this altar, in November of 1991, Dahmer said that the altar was intended as a shrine to himself, a place where he could quote-unquote feel at home, before adding that had the police arrived 6 months later, they would have found the completed altar in his living room. On July 25th, 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer ends up being indicted on 4 counts of first-degree murder. By August 22nd of that year, this has been increased with 11 more murders. In September, acting on information obtained from Dahmer's confession, officers in Bath, Ohio, locate bone fragments and are eventually able to identify Stephen Hicks, Jeffrey Dahmer's first victim. And Dahmer ends up being indicted on murder charges in Ohio on September 17th of 1991. Dahmer ends up not being charged with the attempted murder of Tracy Edwards, nor is he charged with the murder of Stephen Chiami, as the district attorney would later state. Without evidence of a body, they cannot move forward with prosecution. On January 13th, 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer pleads guilty by reason of insanity to a total of 15 counts of murder. Dahmer's trial begins on January 30th of 1992. The defense argued that Dahmer was insane and was unable to control his impulses due to his desire to commit necrophilia. Now, I could dive deep into the trial of Jeffrey Dahmer. I am not going to do that, however, as Dahmer pleaded guilty but insane. He ends up being found guilty of all 15 murders after a 2-week trial. On February 15th of 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer is found guilty and to be mentally sane at the time of each of his 15 murders. On February 17th, the day that Jeffrey Dahmer is to be sentenced, he addresses the court, stating that he had never wanted freedom after his arrest, and that he'd actually wished for his own death. That none of the murders he had committed had been driven by hatred, and that nothing he said or could do would be able to undo the harm that he had caused. Dahmer further stated that while he understood that humanity would never forgive him for the things he had done, it was his belief and hope that God would. Ending his statement with, quote, "I know my time in prison will be terrible, but I deserve whatever I get because of what I have done. Thank you, Your Honor. Am I prepared for your sentence, which I know will be the maximum? I ask for no consideration." Dahmer is basically sentenced to eternity in prison. After this, Dahmer's father Lionel and stepmother Sherry are granted 10 minutes with him before he is transferred to prison, where he is to begin serving his sentences. In May of 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer pleads guilty to the murder of Stephen Hicks in Ohio. Dahmer ends up in solitary confinement at the Columbia Correctional Institution. He becomes something of a cause celebrity, receiving various donations and correspondences from people all across the world. After his first year in prison, Dahmer requests and is granted a transfer from solitary confinement, where he is put into a 2-hour daily work program. Now, Dahmer ends up being baptized while he's in prison. My personal belief has always been that Jeffrey Dahmer had a death wish. Having been discovered and confronted with his crimes, he realized that he had nothing further to give to society, and that the only way out for him, the only way that people could find closure, would be with his death. And I think that is why he not only ends up embracing Christianity as he prepares himself for the end, but also requests to be transferred out of solitary confinement and into a place where he would have interactions with other criminals, many of whom wanted to see Jeffrey Dahmer die. On July 3rd of 1994, an inmate attempted to murder Jeffrey Dahmer with a razor blade that was embedded into a toothbrush. After this assault, Dahmer's family stated that he was readily accepting the fact that he was most likely going to die in prison, and that he was embracing this reality. On November 28th, 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer left his cell to go on a work detail with two prisoners, Jesse Anderson, a convicted murderer, and Christopher Scarver, also a convicted murderer. They were assigned to clean the prison gym, and at roughly 7:50 a.m., the trio who were in the process of cleaning the showers were left unsupervised. At roughly 8:10 a.m., Jeffrey Dahmer and Jesse Anderson were both discovered on the floor of the bathrooms unconscious from extreme head wounds. Christopher Scarver had used a 20-inch metal bar and bashed both men in the heads. Jeffrey Dahmer was alive as he's rushed to the hospital. However, he dies an hour later. Jesse Anderson dies 2 days after this. Scarver returned to his prison cell after having committed this crime and informed one of the officers who was guarding him of what he had just done. This is how Anderson and Dahmer's murders were learned of. According to this officer, Scarver said, quote unquote, "God told me to do it. Jesse Anderson and Jeffrey Dahmer are dead." Scarver later stated that Jeffrey Dahmer's final words were, "I don't care if I live or die, go ahead and kill me." Dahmer stated in his will that he did not want any services held for him and that he wished to be cremated. This was carried out in September of 1995. However, Dahmer's brain was retained as there was a fight between his parents. One wanted it to be preserved for study, the other wanted it destroyed, and in the end, Jeffrey's brain ends up being cremated in December of 1995. And this is really the end of our look at the case of Jeffrey Dahmer. And I really hope that you guys have enjoyed this. Jeffrey Dahmer was a very complex and unique individual in terms of serial killers, in that it appears from his own words that he did not enjoy the act of killing. He did not want to commit these murders, but due to whatever it was that was inside of him, he was completely unable to stop himself. However, we have to take these statements he made with a grain of salt, as Dahmer was a serial killer. The reality is probably that while he did not enjoy the act of killing in and of itself, the outcome to him was the important thing, that he would have these individuals' bodies and that he would be able to enjoy their remains. I don't believe there was any remorse or sorrow within Jeffrey Dahmer. It was all about self-preservation. He admitted to the crimes that he had committed in an effort to preserve his own life, However, I also feel that there was a extreme level of self-loathing within himself. His talks about suicide, I believe, were just that. I don't think that, given the chance, Dahmer would have taken his own life willingly. However, once he was in prison, detesting what he was, he put himself into a situation where another individual was able to take his life from him, thus ending the misery that Jeffrey Dahmer was in. I mean, all of the things that he did were self-serving in the end, and had nothing to do with seeing justice for his victims done. I hope that you guys have enjoyed this series. We're going to end it at this point. Until next time, stay morbid.